inviting me to host this evening's event and for making Douglass Week the resounding success that it continues to be. I don't think that I've ever seen anything like it. I think, the way people have come together to give their time, to give their knowledge and enthusiasm has been something really, really special. So I'm honored to be a part of it. So thank you. I'd also like to say a few more thank yous before I start to our esteemed poet guests, to our very special guest, Roger Guenveur Smith. Thank you, Roger, for the time and the care that you've given to this week's events. Thank you to the entrants of our poetry competition. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience who's tuning in from really, across the world, all sorts of countries and time zones we see in the attendee list. So thank you. And finally, I'd also like to thank the Irish Association for American Studies, who are kindly sponsoring this poetry competition. The event will feature readings by acclaimed poets from the US and Ireland, some of whom have written poetry especially for this event. So we're really lucky to have that. We'll then announce the winner of our poetry competition, and Roger has kindly agreed to read the winning entry for us. After that, I'm going to invite all the artists into discussion, and I'll also invite attendees, so audience members, to ask questions of our guests using the Zoom Q&A function. And I'll let you know when we'll be opening up the floor to questions. The event is being recorded, as Tim said. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests. The poets first in alphabetical order. Their full biographies will be on the Douglass website. Chiamaka Enyi-Amadi is a writer, editor, performer, and arts facilitator. Her work has been featured in Poetry International, Poetry Island Review, RTE Poetry Programme, IMA Magazine, Architecture Island, the Irish Times, and most recently in The Art of the Glimpse, 100 Irish Short Stories, which is a fantastic anthology edited by Sinead Gleeson. And she's the co-editor of Writing Home, the New Irish Poets Anthology. Tess Gallagher, American-born poet, has made Irish culture central to her life. 15 years ago, she purchased a cottage near her companion, the late painter Josie Gray, in Northwest Ireland, where she had written her second book during the Vietnam War. Her 11th book, Is Not, documents political and meditational cross-currents in her Irish and American lives. Tess attends to the work of her late husband, Raymond Carver, and participated in Birdman and Shortcuts, two films, of course, centered on his stories. A lifelong witness to women's concerns, the poem that Tess will read for us today documents a historic moment for Irish reproductive rights. Gary Copeland Lilley is the author of 8 books of poetry, the most recent being The Bushman's Medicine Show from Lost Horse Press, and a chapbook, The Hog Killing, from Blue Horse Press in 2018. He is originally from North Carolina and now lives in the Pacific Northwest. He has received the Washington, D.C. Commission on the Arts Fellowship for Poetry. He's published in numerous anthologies and journals, and he is a Cave Canem Fellow. Kimberly Reyes is an award-winning poet and essayist and the author of 3 books, most recently Running to Stand Still by Omnidawn in 2019. She has received numerous fellowships, including from the Poetry Foundation, the Academy of American Poets, Callaloo, the Department of Culture, Heritage, and the Gaeltacht in Ireland, and many other places. She has written for numerous publications, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, Film Island, The Irish Examiner, RTE Radio, the Irish Journal of American Studies, Poets.org, The Stinging Fly, New American Writing, and many, many more. A second-generation New Yorker, Kimberly was the 2019 to 2020 Fulbright Fellow studying Irish literature and film at University College Cork. Clara Rose Thornton is an award-winning essayist, multiple slam poetry champion, culture journalist, educator, and activist from Chicago. In the 6 countries in which she has lived, she has given speeches of socio-political import in a multitude of governmental and historical venues, performed
thunderous spoken word poetry, both musical and a cappella, and has worked with organizations and individuals to manifest several progressive firsts, including the inaugural Black History Month Ireland in 2014. While living in Ireland for 6 years, she won the Dublin Slam Poetry Championship no less than 3 years in a row and was a frequent contributor to broadcast and print media. Now repatriated to her home city, where she focuses on education and the Black Lives Matter movement, Clara Rose maintains close ties with Ireland through artistic and socio-political work. Those are our poets, and I would just like to introduce Roger Guenveur Smith, who probably needs no introduction, but here we go. He is an actor, a writer, a director. Roger adapted his Obie Award-winning solo performance of a Huey P. Newton story into a Peabody Award-winning telefilm, which is currently streaming on Hulu. His Bessie Award-winning Rodney King is on Netflix. If you haven't caught that yet, I urge you to do so. It's extraordinary. Roger has also devised theatrical studies of Frederick Douglass and Christopher Columbus, Bob Marley and Jimi Hendrix, iconoclast artists Jean-Michel Basquiat, Simon Rodia and Charles White, and baseball greats Juan Marichal and John Roseborough. His work on screen includes projects inspired by Malcolm X, Thurgood Marshall, Rosa Parks, Nat Turner, and Madam C.J. Walker. You are all very, very welcome to tonight's event. And if I can ask Chiamaka to begin the readings, we will move through our readings in alphabetical order.
Good evening, everyone. It is a delight and a privilege to be amongst such wonderful and inspiring artists. I'm delighted to be taking part in the Douglass Week. And I have an extract from a longer poem, a poem called The Misrecognition of Bodies as Thorns. It's a poem in 4 parts. It was recently published in the Maasai Journal, which is a journal published by the Movement of Asylum Seekers in Ireland as a way to not only raise awareness, but the continuation of the struggle to end direct provision in Ireland. So I'll read the first and second parts of this poem. What does it mean to love your neighbor as you love yourself? When your beauty is stolen from your skin, your hair, and the name your mother gave you when she took you from the wet hands of the midwife. Pale as you were then, your eyes were still darker than the color of sun-baked mud after the rainy season. And she knitted her Africa into your name, tighter than the way God knitted it into your jungle hair and safari skin. And now you cannot look yourself in the eye. You write yourself love notes in Morse code. Each indent is a question. Why faces with skin the color of burnt caramel or coal never grace the crystal ball? Why love is a word said only with your back to the mirror? And why there is so much sting in the silent bleed at the end of each question? 2. What does it mean to love your neighbor as you love yourself? When images of tendrils in test tubes are thrown into your living room and they tell you each cell must be stripped from its host for security purposes, there is much talk of contamination, but then you read somewhere else, somewhere on a smaller, more transparent screen, that it was babies, not tendrils on your flat screen. In incubators, and those bits of charred green flesh on glass-covered floors are bodies, are babies, our bloodied, overexposed flesh peeling in eastern heat, not strong enough for the outside world, not strong enough for the once crisp hospital air. not strong enough for even their mother's touch. But it's been weeks and all. There is only rot and dust now, tendrils or not. It is as good a reason to break from the ritual. Midnight media rounds, the daily stereo contest with the mobile abyss, and mourn as best you can. They were no family of yours. So you will mourn not the loss of shared memories, but the injustice, with no thought of politics or other man-made things. Simply that they were not given the chance to grow into an ally or enemy. Nipped at the tender bud of terror, they will never be old enough to feel like victims or victors, to feel ostracized or socially submerged, to feel that they could be both Arab and Muslim without being a threat to Western security, to feel the warmth of flesh, not metal thorns, to feel without pain. Thank you. Thank you again for giving me a platform to share that poem with you all and with our audience. I'm looking forward to the rest of the program and to our discussion with my fellow poets.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there, but now I've been able to. Chiamaka, that was wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Tess, would you please read your poem to us?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. You know, I'm coming to you from the Northwest of America, and I have realized through this program that I was rather an emotional refugee during the Vietnam War. My husband was in that war, and I came to Ireland from England. And then I didn't have much of a relationship with England after that, because I fell in love with the country. And it saved me, and it didn't save me only that time, it saved me several other times. I think of Frederick Douglass coming to Ireland, and I think of Irish people and the way they give welcome, and on such an even basis, and how they took me in. And I can imagine his getting to be a human being and not just a refugee from slavery. And that is huge, because in our America, Black people, people of color, are not free. They cannot just be human beings. They have to keep really vigilance all the time. So I am very happy to take part in this. I want to read a poem that I wrote while in Ireland. It was in a book called Boogie Woogie Crisscross that I wrote with a friend of mine who was born in an internment, or we call it now prison camp, in America during the Second World War, Lawrence Matsuda. Now, Larry needed some education, so what was going on when I was in Ireland was the death of Savita Halappanavar. She was an Indian immigrant. She came as a fully trained dentist to Ireland, and she was working, and she and her husband had a pregnancy. She was having trouble with it. She came to Galway. It was discovered to be untenable. They kept her there. She expected, as in India, the child would be taken, but no, there was a law which said the baby's heartbeat had to stop before the baby could be taken from her. So it was a race whose heartbeat would win. Would she withstand the loss of her child inside her? And we all suffered this in aftermath when we heard about it. And it was really felt all over England and Ireland and India, especially where she had come from. So it's a very important poem to me, because what happened in Ireland was astonishing. The Irish people overturned this limited abortion law. And in May of 2018, they changed it. So you didn't have to wait until the baby died inside you and you got sepsis, as Savita did, and you died. You didn't have to pay that price now in Ireland. We have a lot of troubles with abortion rights in America, reproductive rights, and maybe we can talk about them in the question part. And I just want to read my poem now. It's called Button Button, which is a childhood game we play, you know, so who's got the button, you know? And that's what happens in these situations a lot. We were going through our abortion fight a lot in the early 60s, and we had pins which said abortion now. So that's how the poem starts. He's talking about those pins, which are hard to find now, I think. Thank the Berkeley Antique Emporium sincerely, Larry, for the 1960s Abortion Now button, though I could not wear it with impunity to the Strand Hill Ballroom of Romance, even having readjusted the baby bump pillow in my trousers when I glimpsed the priest and ducked into the ladies. There, a 14-year-old held out a crisp bag, collecting spare change to get to England on the boat for her solution. Cut marks in a ladder up her arm had failed to convince a judge her life was in jeopardy. Her attempts so amateurish. Ah, you'd have to slice a jugular, and sure, what would be the point? You'd bleed out then and there. She sighed and thumped my pillow as if she liked to take a nap. I dropped a 50-euro note and skint past her belly. On her neck, a cameo of Savita, secured by a black velvet band. Savita, Our Lady killed by a heartbeat. Savita, who took her degree as a dentist in India, then came to die of sepsis and neglect in a Galway hospital. An untenable pregnancy gone wrong, her care put aside for her child's vanishing heartbeat. Take my child, she'd pleaded earlier to no avail, as she traded her heartbeat for her dying baby's silence. Savita, Savita, Our Lady of Long Suffering, who believed her death would not be required. I dropped my not a banker button into the crisp bag, and Savita smiles shyly from the girl's neck, as if she knows her husband is taking her death all the way to the Court of Human Rights.
Tess, thank you. Thank you. That was extraordinary. Thank you so much. Okay, Gary Copeland Lilley, please.
Thank you. I'm honored to be reading with this group of people, this group of poets, and for this audience. As we all know, Douglass was part of the long fight, you know, a long struggle, and when he fought hard for the emancipation and to get the President Lincoln to sign that, and that is the event that forced Robert E. Lee to bypass Washington and take the fight into the Northern Territory, into Pennsylvania. And that was Gettysburg. Lee felt like if he could inflict so many deaths, so much bloodshed on the North, that they would sue for peace. And that's what Gettysburg was. And this is what my poem is about. More people died in those 3 days than died in the entire Vietnam War. Gettysburg. The October woods were red and gold. Past the fence lines of rolling pastures, until I got closer to the battlefield of shops, selling more souvenirs of the rebels their New York Yankee ball caps. Then I was there at the most haunted farms in America. The fallen of both sides are now the landlords of this soil. On Seminary Ridge, the long crooked stretch where the Army of Northern Virginia camped with their cannon aimed towards the blue of Cemetery Hill. I slept that night out in the open until the rains came. A cold, slow hiss on the fire, the shrouds, the dark clouds gathered in. I moved my bag under the Martin shelter, the picnic area. A steady rumble of rain over the grounds, and I couldn't sleep. So I sat on the bench by the dead fireplace from 4 in the morning to the touch of dawn. I expected some gray ghost to saunter up and respectfully join me as I marched through the last cigarettes in my pocket, because the currency that has been paid for me, a Black man, to be there shivering in the Pennsylvania morning, is more monumental than the stone that honors the North Carolina regiment that fought and died opposing my emancipation. More stately than the statue of Robert E. Lee and his horse. 3 death-filled days acknowledged by all mark the resurrection of the free Jesus from the tomb. John Brown standing on the gallows of white man's laws. Like it or not, pray with me or not, or share the can of beer floating like a spirit in my cooler. Everything I have done or will do in America has been paid for with blood.
Wow. Thank you, Gary, that was wonderful. Kimberly.
Hello. I thank you for having me first and foremost. This is wonderful. And I am going to start with a poem that is special for this event. I have always been obsessed with Frederick Douglass, and particularly his time in Ireland. And so I always had a poem called Frederick Douglass Has Lunch in Dublin in my pocket. And I never sort of got around to it until I moved to Ireland. And one of my dear friends, Neve Butler, is from Cove, and her wonderful family showed me around and taught me the history. And I sort of became obsessed with that port. It's such a significant port in Irish history. And, I write so much about journey and, people setting sail for lands that are just the unknown. I mean, obviously that has a lot to do with my history as an American. And so this poem became a sonnet. It's very strange. Right now it's a sonnet. It could turn into something else. And it's tentatively titled Frederick Douglass Recrossed the Atlantic for this sonnet. I don't know at which port he stood, what oar heard inhaling mist and this saline film, reel splicing to a point of no return, in clarity, a shuffling about decks. What's stolen for Van Diemen's Land, Charleston? What of asylum granted, hope harbored, with abandonment? The same pastel gale and silent boats, still frames in cove, Cape Coast, and familiar fetters, boring tide, bloat, lighting channels, every port rang, calling, steadfast incitement, Boston, Liverpool, once faith and mercy met the Irish Sea. What wonder could be felt abreast green sails, raised in insight, heeding every crew's cause. And I'll just read another quick poem from my book, sort of about journey as well. It's dedicated to my grandmother. I always have a grandmother poem. It's called Heat Lightning, the Split Tree, and it starts with an epigraph from Paul Kelly and the Stormwater Boys. It's called, "Don't stand so close to the window. Somebody out there might see, and you're not supposed to be here with me. The walls have ears and the darkness has eyes. Don't you see?" My grandmother's body was still with us, weeks after we tried to leave, weeks after my mother, always nervous, thunderstorms begged me away from the window, flashing jewelry, 3 clanking bangles. Superstition says, don't tempt aroused fate. My grandmother brought back from a trip to the Bahamas, her dream week, her second time on a plane, at 63, solo, still working, still bold enough to save, fly, buy silver. My grandmother's first time on a plane, taking me down to South Carolina to see the farm, the fabled nothing that kept her from becoming something, kept giving her babies just one look, she'd swell. She forewarned the consequence of sass and heat, and one day the opening came to leave the weeds and beatings, a chance up north for cleaning house. I shook my silver at the cracking lavender and pink sky, running on preordained rage and showing my ass and asking for trouble, beckoning prepubescent summer rain in July, New York City. The phone rang, Woodhull Hospital. The weeds came calling. 36 days, no insurance, electrical outages, backup generators, a coma that also refused her offering. Mercy. A stroke the doctors misnamed, respirators, jutting mangles, exploited remains. She awoke, still, slant, face, bile, tubes, snaking their way through her, bidding I pretend to forget. Escape betrayed her body, finally left in August, in cascades of acidic sweat. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Kimberly. And thank you also for writing that poem for us for this evening. I'm really glad that you had Douglass having lunch in your pocket. and I'd love to talk more about how that idea turned itself into a sonnet. But I'm going to now introduce our final poet who will read for us now, last but not least by any means, and that's Clara Rose.
Greetings and salutations, you marvelous lovers of history, empathy, and inclusion. So incredibly happy to be here and be included. One thing that absolutely has my heart soaring this week is the knowledge that this is occurring, this Douglass Week slate of events and celebration in Ireland. Beginning in around 2015, my wonderful comrade and colleague and friend, Shane Curtin, and I, who is one of the attendees here, hello, Shane, we worked very hard to raise awareness about the reality of Frederick Douglass, having spent time in Ireland and having done a lecture tour and being feted and celebrated the way that he was, bringing awareness and knowledge of the abolitionist cause, of the reality and plight of Black Americans, and finding such empathy and bridges built within Irish people's minds at the time deep in famine era under British colonial rule. So many poor Catholics experiencing daily degradation, and while not enslaved, being able to make the mental leap and the empathetic leap that allowed them to understand the universality of second-class citizenship. And that is what Frederick Douglass's time in Ireland represents to me. It's what it represented to Shane and I then when we were organizing a series of performance and historical and education events called Joined Hands in Freedom about this very topic, We made radio appearances. We petitioned politicians to have plaques erected on historical sites in Cork and Limerick, where Douglass stayed, where he spoke. And our event series title, Joined Hands in Freedom, that encapsulates this very idea, this idea of bridging the mental gap that exists so often between the idea of white supremacy and non-white people as other. And unfortunately, when I moved to Ireland in 2013, I became quite disillusioned because I was thinking that, having been a nation of white individuals who were historically experiencing degradation at the hands of imperialism, that there would be this incredible amount of empathy and anti-racism threaded throughout the fabric of daily existence there, of cultural mindsets there. And I was mistaken. There was and remains so much xenophobia and racism that occurs from the casual, everyday basis all the way up to institutions such as direct provision and restrictions placed in law and systems that affect and limit the lives of people of color in Ireland. And being part ethnically Irish myself, my heart just broke a bit because of some of the things that I experienced and that I witnessed happening. Now, this poem that I'm going to read for you all today, not so much read, more shout from memory. That's my modus operandi as regards poetry. It's called to action to abandon the violent thinking of people of color in Ireland as other, as a threat to a narrow perception of an Irish way of life, to abandon this violent thinking and to understand the universality of second-class citizenship. It's what Douglass's time in Ireland represents. It is what this piece, Invisible Enemy, is about. And it is my absolute hope for the future that this mindset continues to dissipate. This piece is called Invisible Enemy. Truly understanding the concept of inclusion is a process that involves removing the mask you defer to each morning when asking the mirror about your own fate. The mask you wear as the mirror tells you you are exactly where you are supposed to be. And the soil you stand on is yours as it was your father's and as it stands and shall ever be. The mask that informs you of correctness, that informs you of the correct state of affairs, custom fit to your jawline, its lines of heredity etched deep, its lines of pride carved deep. Truly understanding the concept of inclusion is the recognition that this mask is a bit of armor. This mask, it's a bit of armor. And when is it that a fighter needs to fight? When is it that a fighter covers his wounds to display his might? Why choose to make every day your battleground? And who is this enemy you're convinced is staring you down? Why ready a face each and every day to fight an army of difference you see advancing from across the clay, dead set on snatching that sameness you've been taught to regard as non-threatening? The all day long battle cries, heard in phrases like, go home to Africa, Go back up your tree, you black bastard. You packies, you foreigners galore. Jesus, give this soil back to me. Inclusion is leaving out the fear. Inclusion means leaving behind the fear. Pronouncing the battle lines of division hazy and less clear. We are yet like angels, angels in mid-flight, movable, ethereal, and in each instance we reveal our own weightless nature when we do what we know to be right. Put down your mask. Place down the armor. For no one asked for this fight. Because in the end, there is no victory to be won. There are only misdirected shows of might. No fear. No fear. Thank you.
My goodness, thank you so much. What a beautiful performance to end our readings on. Thank you. Well, hard to follow this, but we will. I want to thank you, first of all of the poets for sharing your poetry with us. They were inspiring poems, moving poems, powerful poems, thought-provoking poems. They've given us a lot to talk about, which we will do soon. But before that, it gives me great pleasure to announce the winner of the Douglass Week Poetry Competition. We had a fantastic response to the competition. Thank you to everyone who entered, and we really enjoyed reading your poems. There were some really fantastic entries, but one entry stood out for the judges, and they were unanimous in their decision to choose Olga Dermott-Bond as the winner. So congratulations, Olga. Now we're going to meet Olga in a little bit, but first let me give you a brief biography of Olga, and then I will introduce Roger to read her poem. Olga Dermott-Bond is originally from Northern Ireland, and she lives now in Warwickshire. She has had poetry and flash fiction published in a wide range of national and international magazines. And in 2019, she won the BBC Proms Poetry Competition. Her first poetry pamphlet, Apple Fallen, was published by Against the Grain Press in March 2020. And her second pamphlet, A Sky Full of Strange Specimens, will be published by Nine Pens Press later this year. She is a teacher and she has two daughters who are being quiet in the next room, I think, Olga. I want to really congratulate you on writing a really beautiful poem. And I'm now going to invite Roger Guenveur Smith to read that poem for us. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Olga. And I hope that I can do this wonderful work some justice. It's entitled 175 Years. A man stands outside St. John's Church holding a Bible like an empty checkbook. A man boards a train, then a boat across a wide Susquehanna River. The windows boarded up speak of a hard darkness inside, like cracked leather. He is free. A bright world flung wide open, and anything might be possible. Protesters have been gassed, removed, kneeling across the street. I can't breathe. Will like iron, he sails far, writes, speaks, prays, loves. the soft gray Irish fog that embraces him. His every lie cuts as a blunt razor's edge. America falls, bruised and bleeding, tells us again through history's rusted journey of a single truth. Black lives matter.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. And thank you, Olga. Just a little tearful from all of this. I think if you just excuse me. Olga, I'm gonna open up the conversation to all the poets, but I'd like to start with you and just if I could just speak to the host for a moment to just bring us all back onto the screen, if that's at all possible. But Olga, it's a beautiful poem. Thank you very much. One of the things that struck me about it, obviously, is how quietly devastating it is. In its very kind of economical yet highly evocative parallels. We weren't able to see what it looks like on the page, but it's and you'll be able to describe this better than I will. But it's in two kind of columns, if you like. And you strike this parallel between events of 2020 and Douglass's life. So on the one hand, we have the 45th president of the United States ordering the tear gassing of peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters so that he can make his short way to a church that he rarely frequents, to hold up a Bible that he really doesn't read in order to pose for a photo opportunity. And on the other, we have this young man embarking on his journey to freedom, a fugitive slave who will travel to the north, who will publish his life story, who will travel further to Ireland to continue his tireless campaign for abolition and human rights. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how this poem came to be.
Sure. Well, first of all, huge thank you. I'm so honored and humbled to be here with such stellar poetic company. I feel like a very tiny fish in a great poetry ocean this evening. And thank you, Roger, for reading that poem in such a majestic way. Thank you. Yeah, really happy to talk a little bit about the inspiration. I was going back through my poetry notebook to see where it all began. And when I was thinking about Frederick Douglass and doing some more research on him, there were actually various ideas that I had discarded. So initially I thought I would do a found poem because obviously his writing is so wonderful. That was one idea I had. Then I thought I might do a golden shovel. So take one of his really beautiful quotations, of which there are so many, and create a poem, in the golden shovel form. And I was also thinking, and I think I might still write this one, hopefully one day, I was going to write one from Frederick Douglass's wife's point of view when she was getting his sailor clothes ready to help him escape. I thought that was just such a wonderful part of the story. But anyway, all of those ideas were discarded ultimately because ever since the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, that shook the whole world, and everyone was just kind of so appalled by those events. And in particular, that image of Donald Trump standing and gassing his citizens to take a photo shoot in front of that boarded up church holding the Bible. It was such a frightening moment for me, really. It was kind of like this toxic dictator who had lost all sense of reality. And I knew that I had known for a long time I'd wanted to write about that image. And I think what's really beautiful in poetry is when two different worlds collide and you've got two oppositions in a poem. So I went back to that image, and then the thing that struck me above all in Frederick Douglass's fantastic story is a sense of movement, this sense of dynamism, this sense of energy and optimism, really, that he felt that things could change and things could be better. And that was the starting point of my poem, really. And once I had that, it was one of those poems that it didn't really fight me very much. I'm sure the other poets will know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you have a poem that really struggles and fights you all the way. But once I had that counterpoint, it kind of wrote itself, really. But I did know that I wanted to incorporate the lines, "I can't breathe" and "Black Lives Matter." And it was very important to me that the poem ended on a moment of optimism. And, and this was, of course, before the events on Capitol Hill only a few weeks ago. So I did want it to end on a positive note. So I hope that explains a little bit about the genesis of the poem, but I really enjoyed writing it. And Frederick Douglass is just a dream to write about because he's such an endlessly fascinating character.
Yeah.
Oh, and I should also say, sorry as well, in the poem, when I mentioned the soft grey Irish fog, that is lifted from his diaries as well, because I was so captivated by how much he loved Ireland. And I love the fact that even though it was really terrible weather and it was really rainy and cold, he still really loved it. So that made me love him even more.
Yeah, it's always quite bad weather. Yeah.
We love it.
Thank you, thanks, Olga. That's a great explanation and to a great poem. And I'd really love now to just bring everyone back into the conversation. There are quite a few of us, and we have about 25 minutes left to talk about your inspiration, to talk about some of the ideas behind your poems. And sort of share ideas and comments about them. So I'm hoping we can do that. And I'd also like to, at this stage, open up any questions to the audience. So if you have any questions for our poets or our performers, please feel free to type them in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But I think maybe we can kind of develop, the points you were making there, Olga, about, how relevant Douglass still is, and how those images and those words, they just stay with us. I mean, I teach the narrative in my own modules at university, and year after year the narrative is the text that all the students want to write about, and they have not necessarily come across anything like it before, and they can't let go of it. They want to read more, the speeches, the poetry of his writing is extraordinary. But it also strikes me that a lot of the images that were coming from your poems that were reaching back into his life are incredibly resonant now. I'm thinking of Gary Copeland Lilley's beautiful Civil War poem, and you just mentioned them now, Olga. The attack, the assault on the Capitol. We saw the Confederate flag being brandished in in the Capitol. It's there. It's mounting. So I wonder if anyone of you would, maybe Gary to start with, but anyone else who kind of brings these parallels into their work. I know you do, of course, Roger. Talk a little bit about how you see elements of Douglass's life being incredibly relevant and resonant, and maybe teachable, now. Gary, what do you think?
I see the relevance when I see people still fighting and protesting against the Confederate battle flag. That is a very strong symbol to me. That's something that we need to continue the work towards abolishing that whole feeling of supremacy and stuff. It's also, we can recognize it as a symbol of those people who are still carrying that flag around, of how much strength it carries for them. And so it's like the Civil War has not ended, you know, it's just taking a moment or so. It's a different type of fight now. We're fighting in the houses of government, and we're fighting everywhere else, but it still continues. And that's where I see Douglass's fight, that long fight. I see us stepping into his footsteps, actually, and just continuing this battle.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think you're absolutely right. I was wondering if Roger could speak more to this, but yes, he is there. I was wondering if you're there, Roger. You know, you use, obviously, you know, in your show, Frederick Douglass, in your one-man show, and the way you kind of, in very poetic ways, kind of mash up, you know, different perspectives and you know, parallel lives or events or figures. Could you speak a little bit more about these ideas?
Sure. First of all, let me congratulate all of the poets for, you know, embracing history and making it live and breathe in the present moment. In the tradition of Frederick Douglass, in the tradition of Anna Murray Douglass, who put that, yes, sailor suit together to disguise her fiance on his way north to freedom, who worked on the Underground Railroad with him, freeing other people, Anna, and who was a free woman, and Frederick, who was a self-liberated man, were not simply focused on their own freedom. They were absolutely committed to the freedom of an entire community, of an entire nation, and not just a Black nation, a nation of all people. Douglass always had a vision of a world in which we were all liberated. And when there was an obstacle to freedom, Anna stepped up against it, and Frederick stepped up against it, and our poets today are stepping up against it with that great weapon of the word, which Frederick Douglass, of course, recognized, and he was the master of it. It is no surprise that his first book was entitled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and most importantly, written by himself.
Yeah, absolutely, Roger. Thank you. There's a lot of points that have just been made by Gary and Roger that I would like to pick up on. Perhaps most importantly, the power of the word, and the power of rhetoric, the power of poetry. I think I'd like to kind of loop back to that in a second, because I'd also like to bring in other ideas of parallels. We've looked at the parallel kind of journeys and soils, if you like. There are a lot of interesting images of, I think a line from Gary was extraordinary about the fallen being the landlords of the soil. And this idea of, a history embedded in layers and layers of land. And this makes me think of a number of things. It makes me think of the journeys that are written into your poems. It makes me think of ideas of belonging and home. And, what Clara was saying, that age-old trope of, go home. So I wonder if some of you can talk about the meaning of that in your poems. I'm thinking of Tess's poem, obviously, about Savita, who came to Ireland, who called Ireland her home and died here.
but also, of course, from that, the change that was brought about. And I'm also thinking of Kimberly's poem. I'm thinking of Chiamaka's work. I'm thinking of Clara Rose's work. So I wonder if ladies, you would like to respond to these ideas of journeying and how that figures in your work, but also ideas of belonging and home. Perhaps Kimberly, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. It dawns on me that like so much of this week is a celebration of Frederick Douglass coming here to feel human for the first time in his life. And, just this sort of, and it should be celebrated, but I do think to parallel, and just to jump off of a bit of what Clara spoke about quite eloquently, let's not sort of pretend that like he might get the same welcome nowadays. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think I only just read this week this article in the Irish Times. It's a brilliant article, and I'm going to put it in the chat actually, about George and Kencho. Let me know if I pronounced that right, but it's this sort of reading that article from an American perspective. I finally sort of understood maybe what the world sees of America, just reading headlines about George Floyd and sort of the publicization of him being this sort of instantly becoming this monster. And, he had a knife and he's got mental illness and all these things. And I just think it's so important in this article, the way that we understand that before that fateful night, George's life was defined by racism, just absolutely his state of mental health was defined by the racism that he experienced in Ireland. And I just feel like we can't get away from that. And I think this sort of exceptionalism of, Ireland was the land that Frederick Douglass came to feel human. If we would like to get back to that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And, to sort of bury your head in the sand of, we're not like them. You don't want to become like America, but, I think this is, again, I'm going to put this in the chat. This is a really good article to maybe light some, fire under the fact that you're closer than you think. And, I just think that needs to be acknowledged.
Could I piggyback there on something that Kimberly was saying?
Go ahead, Clara.
Thank you. Marvelous. Oh my goodness. Imagining Frederick Douglass coming to Ireland today and making rousing, fiery speeches about anti-racism and abolition, the complete freedom to exist as they are for Black people in Ireland. Oh my goodness. I'm having an anxiety attack just imagining all the reactionary articles in the Irish Independent, that would come out. I mean, myself being there doing poetry about Black Lives Mattering around the first of the most recent 3 uprisings in 2014 as a result of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman, being acquitted. That's when I started doing more content in Ireland about the issue. And though I got a lot of support, there was also so much backlash, inexplicably, from people who online and in my face after events were saying, well, don't you think this isn't really an Irish issue? Don't you think you should maybe go back to America and talk about those things? We're not racist here. We're not killing people like the cops are there. Don't you think that, if you're going to be taking up Irish people's time and mental space, that it needs to be more, relevant to things happening on these shores? And just the conversations that I would get into, trying to calmly enlighten people that myopia is not a positive thing, and to try to reach outside of your limited framework and of life experience, your limited perspective about what people are experiencing in this nation and every white nation across the globe. That would actually allow you to see that it is a universal issue, that othering people is a universal issue, that oh my goodness. So I wanted to relate something that Gary said about the Civil War not being over yet, really just taking a pause, to this idea of Ireland not being racist, right? So in America, obviously, racism and slavery, it is woven through the very fabric of the formation of this country. And there is a theory that the incarceration of Black men, the prison industrial complex, that is merely the continuation of slavery in another form. Black men get much longer and much more harsh sentences for the same crimes committed by non-Black people. The incarceration rate is ridiculous in the Black community. And it's not because Black people are more violent, it's because there's a much higher police presence and much more antagonization. I'm all worked up. Antagonizing from police in these areas. And sometimes just the pure and simple murder of people before we even get to the arrest phase. So just to continuously try to repress and initially annihilate the Black community from the streets of this country, when we contribute so much, when we literally own the popular culture and the artistic realms, and are looked to across the world as what defines so much greatness in America, yet there's still this concentrated effort to keep us subjugated and out of view. Now, this occurring in America. In Ireland, there is a similar, though considered not as extreme because it doesn't appear to be as murderous or violent, but there's a similar trend of making sure that people of color, specifically Black African people, are not represented as being part of the melee of the Irish cultural mix that represents Ireland. I remember being so ecstatic when I saw a Black person in a commercial in Ireland for the first time in like 2014 or 15. I'd already been there 2 years. I'm like, oh my goodness, Black person in media. Wow. I thought it was just me every now and then on an RTE show discussing issues that the African diasporic communities in Ireland had been trying to raise awareness about, but I was given the platform. And I know purely because I have a Western accent, because even though I'm Black, I can be presented as American and Westernized, closer to Europeanness, and as such, still maintain a non-threatening distance from the idea of Africanness, which is still highly demonized in Ireland. I remember once I was walking to the grocery store in a very posh neighborhood that I was living in at the time in Dublin, Clontarf. And I'm just standing on the corner trying to cross the street, and a car pulls up full of young white Irish males, and they start hanging out of the car saying, "What up, gangsta? How is it hanging, homie?" And start like throwing up gang signs, imitating the throwing up of gang signs, and just screaming like gangster and homie at me. And some might say, oh, well, you can't really say that was racist. They didn't say the N-word. They were just being silly young men. Maybe they were just trying to assimilate to your culture. I've gotten responses like that when I tell stories such as this. And I have so many more where just standing in a room in Ireland, people tend to feel the need to publicize the fact that they are very aware that you're not white. Mm-hmm. So this keeping non-white people, non-white Irish people out of the mainstream of the representation of what it means to be Irish, it's happening at every level of your society, from everyday on the street casual racism all the way up to levels of government. Like I mentioned in the introduction to the poem there, the most blaring effect being direct provision, obviously. But yes, our Civil War not being over, and Ireland having just gotten really like noticeable, sizable non-white communities immigrating into the nation a mere 25 years ago. It's like almost an infantile, like more infantile stage of racism than even our country in terms of everyday speech and relating, if that makes sense.
It does, Clara, it really does. Thank you. And thanks for sharing those experiences. It's very important that you do. And Chiamaka, I wonder if you could add to this. And there's also a question here about your work for the Maasai Journal and the other poetic projects that you've been working on. Can you respond to these
to these kind of discussion topics. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee that says they'd like to hear more about that journal that you showed us. How has that work been received in Ireland? And are you surprised by the reaction in any way, or can you comment on the process of creating it?
Thank you for the question. And Clara Rose and Kimberly have said very important and relevant things, and they've highlighted crucial issues within Irish society in terms of racial discrimination, racism. I suppose going to the question of the reception and creation of the Maasai journal, which I have with me here. I believe might still be able to grab copies online. I was not involved in the creation of the journal, so it was mainly the work of co-founder and member and coordinator Lucky Kambule, as well as Bulelani Mufako. But yeah, so really just these are wonderful activists who have direct experience of, who have personal experience of direct provision and are working tirelessly to abolish the system. I do not have personal experience of direct provision, but of course you do not have to walk in the shoes of someone who has a nail in their shoe to know how painful that journey must be. Direct provision is a thorn on the face of Irish society, and it's something that I think it's an issue that I think should anger anyone with a conscience. But in terms of the reception, unfortunately, like most grassroots projects, especially literary projects in Ireland, there's always a very small audience, sadly, for it. I think there is no sort of targeted hatred towards the journal itself. There is just a general societal problem of racism, but that has been, articulated so eloquently by Clara Rose and Kimberly. But yeah, I would encourage everyone in the audience to go to www.maasai.ie for more information. I'm not an expert on the subject of direct provision. I myself need to do more learning and more work. More work can and must be done until the 21 years of direct provision system, I think, has been long enough. And needs to come to an end.
Thank you. Thanks. And I'm sure that the organizers will also provide various links in the chat and also on the website for to access these information and your work there as well. I do know that Roger has to leave us soon, so I'm going to ask a question that perhaps Roger can answer first, and I want to get back to Tess. I have lots to talk about with Tess as well, but and this strikes me as a question for everyone. We've been thinking about activism. We've been thinking about the power of the word, as Roger said, and Douglass wrote very famously that power never conceded anything without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And in his speeches, he often embedded verse, his own and the verse of others, and in his letters as well. So I wanted to ask you what kind of demands you think poetry and art and performance creativity like this that we're all sharing, what kind of demands can it make? And how far do you think it can kind of really help to make a difference? I'm gonna go to Tess, but first, because I know Roger is going to be leaving us, I'm gonna ask you, Roger, to share your thoughts with us on that, and then maybe if you have time to just read, perhaps, or perform a small part of your Frederick Douglass show before you have to leave us.
Gary, thanks for your Gettysburg Address. This piece was written by Frederick Douglass in the spring of 1861 after Fort Sumter fell. It is civil war. It is civil war, 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 war. It is civil war. It is civil war. For 20 years and more, we have given our strength, our moral and political influence to increase the power and ascendancy of slavery. And now this slave-holding power comes with sword, gun, and cannon to take the life of the nation and overthrow the great American government. Well, verily they had their reward. The power given to crush the black man now overwhelms the white man. The nation had put one end of the chain around the ankle of the slave and the other end around its own neck. They've been planting tyrants and they're now getting a harvest of civil war and anarchy. The American people and the government at Washington may refuse to recognize it for a time, but the inexorable logic of events will force it upon them in the end. That the civil war now being waged in this land is a war for and against slavery, and it can never be effectually put down till one or the other of these vital forces is completely destroyed. The irrepressible conflict, long confined to words and votes, is now to be carried by bayonets and bullets, and may God defend the right. It is civil war. Because if there is no struggle, there is no progress. That was a rapper brother Frederick Douglass. From 1818 to 1895, yo, MC Freddie D is still alive, no jive. In 1985, he was alive, and then in 1986, we threw him in the mix. In 1987, he was looking down from heaven. In 1988, he said, march down apartheid, smash down apartheid, march down, smash down, bash down apartheid. In 89, he was right on time, and now it's 30 years after we did this film called Do the Right Thing, and I still gotta bust this rhyme. They love black music, but they hate black people. They love this rhythm, they love this rhyme. But when it comes to the struggle, they don't have the time. They used to love Michael Jackson on MTV, Eddie Murphy and Mr. T, Bill Cosby and Bob Marley and Oprah Winfrey and Halle Berry. And some say to me, wow, I love Spike Lee, but they don't give a damn if we are free. See, they don't know a thing about our history. This history, it was a long journey. You don't stop. This history, it was a long journey, and you don't stop. See, everybody used to rap about money and sex, and then everybody started rapping about Malcolm X, El Haj Malik. The brother was unique. He came to I right off of the street, but they shot him down up in the Audubon Ballroom, and now they're just what, playing Xbox on his tomb? Boom, 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 boom. They shot him down. Boom, boom, shot him down because he wore the crown. Malcolm X, y'all, he never played the crown. He was always throwing down. Now, check out the sound. See, I'm not saying that we can't have no fun. No, that's not my idea of revolution. But please don't forget about Paul Robeson, Big Paul, king of them all, y'all. All-American at playing ball, but that wasn't all, y'all. He was a Phi Beta Kappa, Shakespearean rapper. Big Paul stood tall, y'all. Yes, he was born in the USA, but in his heyday, they took his passport away. Why? Because they didn't like what he had to say, okay? Like, here I stand, an African-American, son of a slave from the cradle to the grave. Are you now, or have you ever been aware of him, understood why they were scared of him? Big Paul, king of them all, y'all. History, it was a long journey, and you don't stop until the break of a new dawn. Like Marvin Gaye say, let's get it on. You got to be strong in this year, Babylon, and this year, Babylon, you got to be strong because you never know yourself until you're back against a wall. Never know yourself until you're back against a wall. Never know yourself until you're back, you're young, you're gifted, and you're under attack. Shot in the back on the Oakland train track. How are we going to deal with that? We must fight back. How are we going to do that? We must learn to read. We must learn to write. We must organize ourselves to fight. Fight for what, y'all? For our life, y'all. I can't breathe, y'all. For our life, y'all. I can't breathe, y'all. I can't breathe, y'all. I can't breathe, y'all. I can't breathe, y'all. We're fighting fighting for a life, and that's a death. MC Freddie D will never run out of breath, because if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Yes, there was a rapper brother Frederick Douglass. Yes, there was a rapper brother Frederick Douglass. Now who do we need? Yo, we need Frederick Douglass. And when do we need him now? Order. Who do we want? We want Frederick Douglass. And when do we want him now? Order. Who do we want? We want Frederick Douglass. And when do we need him now? Now. Shot in the back on the Oakland train track. Wait a minute, Mr. Guenveur Smith. What about the black against black? Against black, against black, against black, against brown, against black, against black. In New York and LA, it's straight against trans, it's straight against gay, and it's black against black, 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 against brown, against black, against black, against black. Oh shit. I almost forget to say that we also died fighting against Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Yo, where's my tiki torch at?
Wow. Wow. We are just speechless. I mean, my goodness. Thank you, Roger. That was astonishing, amazing.
Thank you for
and also in a strange way answered almost all of the questions in the chat. Thank you.
I hope so,
you.
and congratulations on a tremendous week, and with a couple more days to go. I salute you. I am blessed to be in collaboration with all of you. And if there is no struggle, there is no what? Progress. And it's a good journey that you're on. Good to be with you. And thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Roger. Thank you. Well, my goodness, Roger has almost left the building. Again, pretty hard to follow that, but I'm going to go back to Tess, because we haven't heard from Tess yet. And Tess, there are a couple of questions there that you might want to answer. The first one was thinking about journeys and ideas of home and sanctuary and the treatment of the immigrant or the refugee, and how Douglas's journey still resonates and is more important than ever, really, as we face what is kind of commonly known as the refugee crisis. Or you might want to answer a more kind of broad question about the demands that poetry and that art can make. I will leave it to you, Tess, to to decide what you would like to comment on.
Well, I found myself thinking about the tiger and what that did in Ireland, and I don't know. I haven't really wrestled with it with this at the center of it, but I think that during that time, spilling into Ireland came a lot of people of difference. Mainly in the urban areas, however. They did not come out, people of color, into the countryside where I live in Sligo, County Sligo, the northwest of Ireland. But we did have Poles, we had Hungarians, we had Romanians, we had the Russians. And they were our builders. And for the first time, Irish people had help. They had people working for them and taking care of them. And then when we had the crash of the Tiger, there was this great exodus and they left. Some of them had married and stayed. But it was a testing of boundaries, I think. Because they weren't all Catholic, and they were different persuasions, and yet there was an acceptance during that time. I thought that things were stretching, but out in the countryside, there's still not much sign of people of color coming into that land. So there's a lot to be done, and fair enough, Frederick Douglass would not get that welcome he got then, I'm sure, because I hear a lot of things against the travelers, bzz, 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 the travelers. We do have those in the countryside where I am. So yeah, it's inside us too. We have all these automatic reactions to things because we're not used to living with people of color. If we don't live in an urban area, we don't have friends who are Black, even some of us, you see. So we need education. That's where it all begins. You know, we're all extremely ignorant, I would say, as white people. And I tried to accept that. I tried to accept in myself, yeah, I have a lot of white privilege, you know. I can come to Ireland and buy a cottage and the people there love me. I'm white, you know, and I know their language. I've been speaking it for 50 years. I'm a kind of a one of them, really, except in a lot of interior ways. And I never let those things be betrayed while I am there. So that's the main thing that we can do, I think, in Ireland. People, you know, who are woke people, as we want to hope we are from moment to moment, although we slide moment to moment, that we never let down somebody who's being discriminated against, and we stand up beside them and we call the other persons who are doing that. So that's me in Ireland now and me in America. Thank you.
Thanks, Tess. I think we have just a couple more minutes to move through the questions that haven't been answered yet in the Q&A. There's one from an anonymous attendee that says, could the poets talk about Douglass's use of poetic imagery in his speeches and writings to advance the abolitionist cause? Is there anyone that would like to answer that question about what strikes them or stays with them from Douglass's own poetic imagery, from his own figurative language and rhetorical power? Or are you all kind of struck dumb by it?
I'm happy. I'm definitely probably the least expert person on the panel to answer that, but I will certainly speak personally about what strikes me. Again, I think over everything, I think reading his work, it was his great joy and discovery of language and relishing it. And, you know, he talked about learning to read as being this amazing kind of transformative experience for him. And also how he loved to, borrow language from other people. And there was, you know, the scripture, and there were so many different elements. And to me, he strikes me as someone who just never tired of language, who just had a really joyful a kind of discovery of language, you know. That just struck me, this kind of exuberance and joy in what language could do. And I think there was that need in him to just keep on discovering what language could do. I mean, as I said, that's a very non-expert view, but it's just what struck me.
Thanks, Olga. No, I think it doesn't have to be an expert opinion, and it's a poet's opinion, but it's also a, you know, it's a person living in the world, an empathetic person. And, you know, Gary?
When you asked a question about, when the question was read about Douglass's poetics, the first thing that came to my mind was his statement about Independence Day, about the 4th of July. What is the 4th of July to a slave?
Yeah.
You know, and that, in my, you know, his use of like rhetoric towards his politics, that in itself exposes the contradiction to everything, you know. And to think that we were founded with that whole principle of independence and justice and equality for all, but Douglass put it right up front, you know, that this is the contradiction is something that we have to deal with every day, you know. So yeah, that's the one statement of his that came to my mind right away. Stuff, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And it, you know, it struck me when I know we've just got 2 minutes left, but it struck me when I was listening to Roger read Olga's poem as well, you know, where that very striking image of Trump holding up the Bible like a, what did you say, like an empty checkbook, right? Because Douglas also, it's fantastic, isn't it? So it's such a great image. But you know, Douglas really underscored the hypocrisy of the Christianity of the South, right? You know, the way slaveholders hid behind their Christianity in inverted commas. Of course, he was very clear that he was like, this is not the Christianity of Christ. This is something else entirely. But as Gary says, you know, just constantly drawing our attention to and making us look at what we don't want to look at, making us look at the massive fissures and hypocrisies of you know, this kind of free country. And what Clara was saying about Ireland is, I think it holds exactly the same kind of truth, is that, you know, well, we're not racist, we don't have the problems that America has. Yeah, that's not true. So, you know, incredibly relevant, everything that he's written, and these poems, I think, have such force behind them, and are very, very relevant as well. We are coming to the end, regrettably, of an hour and a half. I feel like I could go on all night, but for us, it's quite late over here, and I'm sure that other people have things to do. I want to therefore thank you all again. I'm sure that this conversation can be continued in another way, in another forum, maybe online. Maybe we'll find a way. It's certainly not a finished a finished conversation, and that's something that we've been speaking about all night. So I'd like once more to thank all of our panelists, including Olga, and say congratulations again to Olga for winning that competition. Thank you to Roger, who has left the building. Thank you very much to Tim and to Sarah and to Caroline again. Tim, I don't know if you wanted to just conclude the event, so I will pass over to you. But I just want to say thank you for an absolutely edifying, wonderful evening. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.